Thank you. Yeah, my name is Tracy Neff. I'm a research agronomist for King's Agriseeds. We are a forage company located in the Northeast and service growers from Maine to North Carolina through a dealer source. Our specialty are forages from your cool season perennials, the summer annual crops, winter grain crops for forage like triticale and barley, all kinds of types of forages, and cover crops. My agenda for the meeting did change a little bit, as Chris had mentioned, and one of the things in our discussion as we were putting together to do this presentation is I suggested that we spend just a little bit of my beginning of my presentation to talk about herbicide options for sorghum. The keys for success for sorghum is there's an ideal planting temperature, which is about 68 degrees. That is generally recognized as the ideal soil temperature to plant all types of forage sorghums, from the true forage sorghums to the sorghum Sudans to the Sudan grasses. But we can plant sorghums earlier than that, when our soils are about 60 degrees, but in a warming trend. So I originate from south central Pennsylvania. So around Memorial Day, or the end of May each year, is about the time when we're at 60 degrees and starting to warm. Now that can vary a little bit from year to year, but generally if we wait till it's 68 degrees, we've shortened up our growing season a little bit. So we can go when we're 60 degrees and a forecast warming trend is forecasted. What we don't want to do is plant too early. Sorghums are summer annuals. They like heat. And if we plant too early and we get a lot of cold temperature below 60 degrees at night for long periods of times, or cooler, some of the things that are going to happen is we're going to get poor emergence of the seed, we're going to get lower plant populations, and then we're going to end up with more weed issues. Weed control can be challenging in sorghums because they are a small seeded plant that emerges slowly. Doesn't have that early vigor that corn does. It's much less vigor coming out of the ground, even when we're at that 60 degree and warming soil trend. And that slowly emergence allows weeds to compete for light, water, and nutrients. And then this is complicated by the fact that there are very few herbicides actually labeled for forage sorghums compared to corn. Now you can find herbicides listed for grain sorghum, but grain sorghums are not forage sorghums. So if you take a herbicide that's listed for use on a grain sorghum and apply it to a forage sorghum, you are technically off-label. This is a page out of a booklet I'm going to show you very soon that you can get access to. When we look at some of the herbicides that are strictly labeled for forage sorghums, it is some of the older chemistries that have been around for a while. Things like atrazine, metallochlorodual, combinations of those that give us what the old bicep was and still is used today. Expert, which is basically the bicep with some glyphosate or Roundup. Phalostar, which is Roundup and dicamba. Atrazine and dicamba marksman. And you can see here, this column, these are all kind of your pre-plant or pre-emergent herbicides that can be used on forage sorghums. And the column here, this first column in the green on your left, is what I would call the true forage sorghums. The center is your sorghum Sudan hybrids, and this is the column for the Sudan grasses. And notice there are no herbicides listed for pre-emergent or pre-plant use on Sudan grass, and we'll talk about that in a second. But what's important is to pick the right herbicide and know your weed spectrum that you want to try and control. On this page here's also, if we're doing like a sorghum Sudan or a Sudan grass where we can use some post materials, lists the interval required before we graze or feed. So a really nice resource for sorghums on one page. Again, we can use atrazine on a lot of our forage sorghum types, but we cannot apply atrazine to Sudan grass. You will see damage. So that gives us a situation where we have to be careful and always start clean. All of our sorghum crops, whether we're using a herbicide or not, because, as I said earlier, they are a slower emerging crop, it is very important to start clean. That could be clean tillage, or that could be a good burn down application, but a clean start is the key to a good sorghum stand to start off. And if we use dual on a forage sorghum or a sorghum Sudan, it must be properly treated with Concept. That is a material that's put on at seed conditioning time by the seed companies. It's actually kind of like an antidote for dual. It allows that plant to metabolize the dual and not cause injury. If you apply dual to a sorghum that is not Concept treated, you're going to see a lot of plant damage, what they used to call the buggy whipping, where the leaves don't unfurl, and you're going to have poor stand, and it will hurt the stand for the life of the stand. Another page that's in this book is relative performance on different grassy weeds. And we have different grassy weeds listed here like seedling and rhizome, Johnson grass, crabgrass, yellow foxtail, goosegrass, switchgrass, whatever. And the different herbicides are related with effectiveness, E for excellent control, G for good, F for fair, and P for poor. Also in this booklet, there's another sheet talking about broadleaf control, looking at the effectiveness of these herbicides on things like cockleburl and Jimson weed and your lamb's quarters, pigweeds, morning glory, and a host of others. So it's really a nice resource book. And the last page that's in this book, and there's a lot more pages, I'll show you in a second, but the last page I'm showing is this one. And this is very important for us, especially in the Northeast, and I think in a lot of areas, is your rotational crop restrictions. Depending upon when you're harvesting your sorghum, how long you're going to let it grow out there, if you pick a herbicide, you need to think of your following herbicide and the following crop that's going to be going into where that herbicide was planted. Some of these have restrictions of maybe 2 cropping seasons next year, some are just a couple months. Very, very important, because we can get damage from our following crop if we go too soon. And sometimes herbicide damage from a residual carryover may not be visible that it actually hurts the stand or you see browning, but it could actually set that crop back. And unless you had an actual check strip in the field where you didn't spray anything, you may not notice that that plant maybe isn't tillering as much if it was a small grain or something like that, or that you're going to hurt your yield down through the end. The book that I'm talking about, and I have a copy of it right here, this is an excellent resource book that was actually produced by Advanta and Alta Seeds. Now it's in a hard copy here, but if you go to their website, you type in Alta Seeds, it'll come up Advanta US, and you click on that. This is going to be their web page. And down here in the bottom corner, if you click on this book, it will actually download to your computer as a PDF file. And so you can have this for free. And it's a really great resource. In this book, it's over 100 pages talking about types of sorghum. There's forage quality, versatility, agronomic management, weed and herbicide management, insects and disease. There's some nice pictures in here, how to harvest, how to feed. It's a really great resource book. So if you're interested in looking at using some sorghums and want a good resource book, this is really nice instead of trying to navigate through a couple different web pages on the internet from different sites. This is a really nice booklet, so I would recommend it. So I wanted to present just a little bit on herbicides. We hope down the road, and I would think Advanta is talking to some of these chemical manufacturers to do more work on getting more herbicides listed for sorghum. As the sorghum acres increase in the U.S., we hope that happens to give us a little more viable options for more weed control. So Dr. Teutsch had talked about sorghums, and of course he had talked about their extreme drought and heat tolerance, that they're very adaptive, the diverse uses. He talked a little bit about the multiple harvests on the sorghum Sudans and the Sudan grasses, and he showed some slides on the economics of it. 3 main types are forage sorghums, the true forage sorghums that we usually look at as a direct one-cut harvest, like corn silage. We then have our true Sudan grasses, which are generally used for multiple cuts. We can make silage out of that, put that in a bag or a bunk. We can do some round bales. We can graze it. But the Sudan grasses also give us one other option. You can make a dry hay out of a Sudan grass. It tends to have a drier stalk, a smaller stalk than a sorghum Sudan. Now it's not going to dry like an orchard grass would. We need a little more time than that. But with some conditioning and maybe 2 teddings, with the right drying conditions, bright sunny day, little air movement and some lower humidity, we can make some dry hay out of a Sudan grass. So that's another option for usage. And then of course we have these sorghum Sudans, which are primarily a cross between the top 2. Again, multiple cuts, silage, baleage, grazing, but not really dry hay. Maybe in some areas of Texas or Oklahoma in the very arid temperatures, they could maybe get a sorghum Sudan grass to make dry hay. But in my area, Pennsylvania and in the Northeast, we got to use the Sudan grass for dry hay, and the rest of them are taken as wet baleage or wet forages. Of course, this is a picture of the 7401 that Chris had talked about from Advanta, the dwarf forage sorghum, and it's about as tall as me, and I'm a little not quite 6 foot, but this was taken in 2011. But like any other crop under good growing conditions, this hybrid will change a little bit. This was 2012 in Virginia, and that was below the Roanoke area, and that field actually went 28 tons. And that is the Bacritic dwarf forage sorghum 7401. 2012, as Chris said, we had adequate conditions, and it was just a really great year for sorghum. It wasn't too wet. It wasn't too dry. And remember, corn will actually take wetter conditions than sorghum will. Sorghum does not like wet feet. It prefers and actually performs better in drier years. When we're looking at most of the forage sorghums, we're talking about a direct cut system like corn silage. We're going to let the heads come out, they're going to swell, and in the 7401 we're going to get the seeds then changing to kind of a milky color. At that stage, I go in and I start pinching the kernels between my fingernails. And you'll get a milk stage where it's actually squirting a little milk. That's milk stage and not quite soft dough. But over a period, as Chris said, it's fairly short depending upon temperatures. Around 7 to 10 days, you're going to be probably harvesting that at soft dough. You'll be checking and the kernels will still be able to be pinched easily between your fingernails, but they won't be squirting milk anymore. And that gives us our time to harvest our forage sorghums as a direct cut. Now, the moistures are going to be usually higher than corn silage. Instead of that 65 to 68%, these are going to be more like 70 to 73. Sorghums tend to have a little wetter stalk than what a corn plant does, and they tend to have a little bit of a waxier leaf, which helps them in their drought and heat tolerance, so they have a little higher total plant moisture at harvest when they're in the soft dough stage. And normally we recommend what I call horizontal storage for the sorghums. I like to see them more in a bag or a bunk or a trench than in an upright. Now the funny thing is, if you did corn silage at 73% moisture, you would think you're going to have maybe a little bit of a river running out of that bag or that bunk, and that's true. But for some reason, we can do forage sorghum at 73%, and it will not juice as much as corn silage does. It's just hard to explain why, but it does that. One of the things I want to talk about, of course, we've been talking about forage sorghum, direct cut. I want to talk about another use of forage sorghum that's kind of started in the Northeast a few years ago. Rather than using one of the Bacritic dwarf forage sorghums, letting it go whole season to soft dough and chopping it direct like corn silage, I'm talking about using one of those taller types, like the 10 that gets to 10, 11, 12 foot that we worry about lodging when it gets to soft dough. We had some growers that started taking it, changing how they planted it, and harvesting these taller forage sorghums earlier when it was in boot stage, prior to head emergence. They were mowing it, they were wilting it, and kind of treating it like a sorghum Sudan, but it was a true forage sorghum. Now what they were doing is they were planting, they were drilling it then in narrow rows, just like they would their sorghum Sudans, but at about 25 pounds to the acre, and then doing a mow and wilt cut. And this started back in '09 with a couple growers down in the western side of Virginia, and they were claiming they were getting the same as 2 cuts of sorghum Sudan in just one harvest of boot stage forage sorghum. So that kind of intrigued me. I thought, I need to look at this, because if that's true, that can be a huge cost savings, because you're only taking one trip over the field, one harvest, one baling or chopping, compared to two with a sorghum to sand to get the same tonnage. So when we look at seeding rates, and Chris talked a little bit about this, sorghum varieties will vary in seed size from about 13,000 to maybe over 20,000 seeds per pound. So there can be a huge difference in varietal seeds per pound. When we're looking at a direct harvest forage sorghum, that'd be chopping it like corn silage, we're normally going to be planting this with a corn planter, maybe in 30-inch rows, or maybe a corn soybean special on 15-inch rows to be harvested with a Kemper head. But generally, we're looking at about 5 to 8 pounds of forage sorghum seed per acre for that direct harvest. We want to target a population of around 100,000 plants per acre. That's what we like to see for a forage sorghum to be direct chopped like corn silage. So if we have about 13,000 seeds per pound, that means we're going to need about that 8 pounds to hit that 100,000 plants per acre. Now when we move to some of these brachytic dwarf varieties, they tend to be smaller seeded, like the 7401 and some of these newer, earlier season brachytic dwarfs that have just been released by Alta Seeds and Advanta. So if I have a sorghum that is 15,000 seeds to the pound, I probably only need about 7 pounds per acre to hit my 100,000. And with some of these brachytic dwarfs that are closer to 20,000 seeds per pound, I only need 5 pounds per acre. So you can see some economics there. With 5 pounds per acre, a 50-pound bag can almost get you 10 acres out of a bag. When we look at sorghum Sudans here at the bottom, the traditional sorghum Sudans that we're going to take multiple harvests of, in our area of Pennsylvania and in parts of Maryland, most of the region, we're looking at about 50 pounds per acre when they drill that. We're trying to target about 600,000 plants per acre. So a sorghum Sudan is going to have a much higher plant population than, of course, a forage sorghum that's going to be planned to be chopped like corn silage. Well, in between that is this mow and wilt I want to talk about. What they've been doing is taking about 25 pounds. Now they're drilling it just like they would their sorghum Sudans, but only at about 20 to 25 pounds per acre, trying to target around 300,000 seeds per acre. When we look at cost, you might think, okay, well, what's the cost difference then? In our area, and again, I'm talking about a BMR 6 forage sorghum, the traditional taller types, not the brachytic dwarfs. The dwarfs do have a little bit of a premium price on them. But a standard BMR 6 forage sorghum, 50 pounds in our area is going to run about $125, $130 a bag. At 25 pounds, our seed cost is somewhere in the $60 range. In comparison, to compare it to a sorghum Sudan at 50 pounds, because they're seeding 50 pounds to get that 600,000 plants, our sorghum Sudans run about $60 to $80 depending on the variety. So it's pretty much, seed cost is fairly similar, unless you go with a really expensive sorghum Sudan, but they're fairly close to $60 per acre seed cost. So, okay, that's about the same. So in 2011, I did a little strip trial. I did this in Lancaster County, and I looked at several different sorghum Sudans. Some of these were BMR. These two were not BMR. I had a Sudan grass and actually a millet. In 2011, I planted on June 2nd, and in 58 days, I had 2 cuts done on the sorghum Sudan. Now, we averaged about 3 tons of dry matter on those 2 cuts. We had a very low second cut because it got extremely dry, and we had poor tillering and some regrowth issues with the sorghum Sudans. So this number for 2 cuts of sorghum Sudans was a little low for 2011. But again, we were harvesting, as Chris said, in that 36 to 48 inch range. That's what we like to take in the Northeast, because we have a little higher humidity temperatures, and if we let sorghum Sudans get above our shoulders or above our head, that's a lot of crop to have out there and to try and get it dry down to that baleage moisture. So these cuts were taken when those sorghum reached that 30 to 40 inch range. And we averaged about 3 tons of dry matter in 58 days. Now remember that. because in the same field, I also planted 2 strips of a taller type forage sorghums. Both these were taller types, planted the same date at about that 20 to 25 pound per acre rate to equal that 300,000 seeds per pound. And this variety was ready in 56 days at boot stage. The 7301 is actually a male sterile product that was a little bit longer in maturity, but it was ready in 65 days. And I got over 3.5 tons of dry matter with 1 cut. So I thought, wow, I did what these guys were saying. They took 1 cut of a forage sorghum at boot stage, and they got about the same tonnage. Actually, we got just a little bit more than they did on a sorghum Sudan at 2 cuts. Well, that was interesting. So I didn't get to do it in 2012, but this past year I reran the trial. And this is actually a replicated trial that I did, again, in Lancaster County. Now, the planting date was a little later because we had wet conditions through early June. But again, I expanded the test, added some more sorghum Sudans in, another Sudan grass, still had the millet there. First cut came in 28 days. We were at about that 38 to 40 inch height. And we had a second cut in 30 days. And we averaged in 2 cuts on these sorghum Sudans about 4 tons of dry matter. Now, that's a little bit closer to what I would expect to get out of 2 cuts. In our region, in the Northeast, about 2 tons of dry matter per cut is a good average number. You can do better than that sometimes. You can get a little bit less, but I think 2 tons of dry matter per acre is a good figure. At the same time, let's remember that number, 4.1, I expanded my test and did a bunch of forage sorghums at boot stage again. Now, in this test, I had some later season forage sorghums, like this 8301. Here's that 7401 that was a late season. I also had, see these here, vegetative? These were some photoperiod sensitive sorghum Sudans that I included in the trial. But I mainly want to concentrate on the ones that are in yellow, because the ones that are in yellow are the forage sorghums that I did at the 20 to 25 pound rate. Now, yes, we had some forage sorghums like 7401 and this 8301 that I took them at boot stage, and they gave more tonnage, but we were out at this, 60, it was greater than 60 days. I wanted to concentrate on the shorter season ones, looking more at that 60 days for 2 cuts. And if we average just the ones in yellow, those averaged 4.8 tons of dry matter. And our CVs were pretty good. They were 9.8 on this trial, and on the sorghum Sudan trial, the average was about 10. So the data wasn't too bad. But 4.1 tons in about 58 days, 2 cuts on those average of sorghum Sudans, to the forage sorghums, the ones in yellow, seeded at that 20 to 25 pound rate, 1 harvest. And this year, we had some that came in actually less than 50 days to boot stage. We had excellent growing conditions this year. We basically had no drought. We had perfect rainfall through the early part of early July before these came off. So again, with some replicated data, and these were replicated plots, 3 reps of everything, it kind of backed up what I did in the strip test 2 years ago, that it looks like we can use a forage sorghum at boot stage and get about the same tonnage with 1 cut as we do with the sorghum Sudan. So the next question is, well, what about the quality? So I did do some quality analysis. This was the quality analysis run through Cumberland Valley on the sorghum Sudans. This block was the first cut. This was the second cut. Our fertility was about 40 units for each cut. The soils I was working on had good manure history. So I tend to go at about, with a soil that has a good manure history, I look at about 1 pound per growing day. If you get into soils that don't have manure history or lower organic matter, then I'm looking at more, a little bit of a higher rate like Chris was talking about down on some of those a little bit poor erodible soils like you have down in Virginia. But our first cut was running about 15.4 on protein. The second cut was a little higher on 17. We had some excellent KD rates. And if you know what KD rate is, that's a forage quality analysis parameter that talks about the rate of passage through the rumen. And a higher number means it's more digestible quickly and it's going to pass through the rumen faster. Numbers in the 5 range on KD rates we quite often see on BMR corn silage or the BMR sorghums. Your typical non-BMR corn, you're going to have KD rates in the 3 to 4 range. And some of your better forages like ryegrass or some excellent quality triticale silage, these KD rates are going to be like 7 and 8. So we got some really good KD rates, and our net energy levels, 65 on the first cut, 63 as averages on the second cut. So there's our quality for the sorghum Sudans. So then I looked at the quality on the forage sorghums at boot stage. And again, all of these products, because we left them go longer to maturity and they were closer to reproductive stage, we were down on protein about 12%. Now, my fertility was different because I was shooting for about 60 days. So I ended up with about 70 units. Again, trying to figure about a pound of nitrogen per growing day. So our proteins were a little lower. We still had some excellent KD rates, and the net energy levels were very similar. So I decided I needed to try and do a little bit more of a summary. I had this trial, I had these samples, so I went back to our office and got into some of our sample database that we had, and I pulled out a whole bunch of corn silage averages, and I averaged them together. I found a bunch of samples that we had sent in for sorghum at the soft dough stage, and I just kind of averaged them together. And I got a whole lot of sorghum Sudan numbers and averaged those together. Now these forage sorghum at boot stage, I had my samples, but then I contacted some of the growers that had been growing this and asked them to send me samples. Now, this is in no way an apples to apples exact comparison because it's not the same number of samples from the same locations. It's just a collective average. But I think it shows a trend, as I want to summarize here. If we look at crude protein, and this number is at 10 for the forage sorghum at boot stage, and I believe it's a little lower because some of the growers this past year that grew it admitted to me when they should have harvested the forage sorghum prior to head emergence, rainy period, couldn't get to it, and they harvested a little bit on the later side. And sorghums are going to be like any other crop, be it a cool season grass. As they get closer to reproductive stage, we know the proteins are going to fall. So I think that's why that's a little lower. I would anticipate if you can harvest timely on these forage sorghum boot stage averages, you're probably going to be in that 11 to 12% range. But they are definitely going to be lower than a sorghum Sudan. And that makes sense because the sorghum Sudan, we're taking vegetatively when it's like 3 to 4 feet tall. Some other numbers to look at are the starch levels. When we look at starch, of course, these two products, the forage sorghum boot and the sorghum Sudan, we're taking them vegetatively, so there shouldn't be much starch. Here is our forage sorghum at soft dough stage, which is at about 16%. Here's corn running around 30, and that's a good number because generally we figure forage sorghum is going to be about, at the most, half, more like 1/3 the amount of starch in corn. Some other numbers to look at are the net energy levels. Again, not bad, very similar to corn, only 0.03 of a point off. And here's an interesting one here is sugar. We know that sorghums have higher sugar levels than corn, especially the forage sorghums. And we know if we let a forage sorghum go to soft dough, the more mature a forage sorghum gets, the more sugar it starts to bank into its plant, to build. So our forage sorghums at soft dough always have a higher sugar level, usually 2 to 3 times that of corn. Our sorghum Sudans have some sugar that's usually similar to corn because we're taking them when they're vegetative yet, but the boot stage, because we've left it get a little more mature and it's getting close to going reproductive, it's starting to build those sugars. So even a forage sorghum at boot stage is going to have a little higher sugar level in it than what we see in a sorghum Sudan. The other thing we see when we look at these NDFD 30-hour numbers, we can see that we had a higher digestibility of NDFD on 30 hours on a sorghum Sudan than we did on the boot stage forage sorghum. And that makes sense too because this is more vegetative and that's getting closer to reproduction. So just to give you an idea of another way to potentially use a forage sorghum to produce a good amount of tonnage in less than 60 days. So where could this fit? In the Northeast, it opens up for us a huge other range of rotational opportunities. Let's say wheat comes off in our area about the beginning of July. Someone could do a boot stage forage sorghum, planted the second week of July. By the second week of September, he could be harvesting that, getting maybe up to 4 tons of dry matter. That opens it up that after that, we're still into September, he's got small grain he could plant. He could go barley, triticale, annual ryegrass. He could plant a crop of crimson clover for a cover crop to go back into corn the following spring. These were planted, the first trial I did in 2011 was the first week of June. The one for 2013 was the 20th of June. So even if we're seeding in June, we're getting that crop off maybe like in August. Then we have the opportunity to maybe go up into a perennial grass or an alfalfa. It just opens up a whole nother range. Not that it's necessarily better than a sorghum Sudan, because if you can get a third cut on a sorghum Sudan, that's going to be your advantage. But in a situation where you're looking for a forage, maybe around 4 tons of dry matter in a short period of time, 60 days, I think this is worth investigating. So to summarize, forage sorghum can be used, I think, in a mow and wilt application like a sorghum Sudan when we harvest it at the boot stage. We can get the data, a little bit of data collected, 2 years, 1 trial strip, 1 replicated, that we in 1 harvest can get similar tonnage to 2 cuts of a sorghum Sudan in about 60 days. The crop can be chopped. Now I will say this, if you're going to bale and wrap a forage sorghum harvested at boot stage, we want to recommend a baler with processing knives. It's a stemmier product than a sorghum Sudan. You're going to have longer pieces. Some growers tried to round bale feed some of that was round baled and wrapped, and they had a lot of sorting and some refusal of some of the longer pieces. So I recommend a baler with processing knives. Other growers were taking big squares that they had baled with a processing knife, put it in their vertical mixers, left it grind for a little bit. They said it grinded up great, and they were making some TMRs, for their dry cows and heifers. The forage will be of good quality and good energy levels. I think it is good quality. We're still above, I think you're looking at that 11 to 12% protein and net energy levels in the 0.65 range with a KD rate 5 or above. But they're going to have lower protein levels than your traditional sorghum Sudans because we're letting the crop get a little longer in season, a little more vegetative. And I think this can really be a good feed source for varying animal groups, especially more of the dry cows and the replacement heifers that possibly don't need as high a quality forage as a milking herd. And with that, nice field of 7401 soft dough forage sorghum there. I'll entertain any questions. Yes.
I guess maybe I don't understand something. You're comparing sorghum Sudan cut twice in a 60-day period to forage sorghum cut once. Why didn't you compare some sorghum Sudan that was just cut once after 60 days?
In that period, depending upon the sorghum Sudans, you'd have to probably go with some of the photoperiod sensitive ones that would not go to head. And in a situation like that, I would, from some of that data that I had collected, you're probably going to get more. Our problem in the Northeast is if we let a sorghum Sudan go to 60 days, we're never going to get it dry. It's just too much material out there to handle to get it to that baleage moisture. Something we might have to look at. Yeah, this was a comparison because these guys were saying they were getting the same as 2 cuts, and in our region out there, we're generally getting 2 cuts most years in that 60 to 70 day range. Here was an option to do it with 1 cut in about the same time. Pardon me, I didn't catch that again.
You have that high mass of material. How are you getting that dried down?
Yeah, well, at 300,000 plants to the acre, it's about the same they've been able to handle that. Some of these sorghum Sudans that are like photoperiod sensitive, we were getting up into the 6, 5 tons of dry matter range, that's where we run into some problems sometimes. So I just tried to do a comparison to reflect what some of the growers were doing, where they were saying, hey, I'm using a forage sorghum as a boot stage cut, and I think we can get a pretty decent amount of some decent forage in a 60-day period. Not trying to replace the sorghum Sudan, but might be an option that might fit into a rotation for you.
On one of your last slides there, you had potassium levels of
Yes.
3.6 and 4%. That's really twice as high as it should be for dairy animals.
Yep.
Can you comment on why that was and what kind?
That's just the way the test, yeah, that's the way the test came out. I put that on there because I do get that question. You know, how high is the potassium levels on that? And on some of them, it did show it was a little higher than corn.
Was that all on the same soil?
Well, those samples, again, at the very end, that little bar had, yeah, that was not an apples to apples comparison. Remember, I just tried to grab as much data as I can, so it was just looking at general averages. Okay, but generally, in most of your sorghums, I'm going to say I don't consider them to be high potassium crops, but they're not going to be what I call low potassium crops either. I think most of the time they're going to come in usually fairly similar to what corn silage would, maybe just a little bit higher.
Related to the maturity of what that is?
Some of it could be maturity. Of course, some of it is soil type. In the Northeast, with our limited amount of acres and our high number of dairy cows, potassium tends to be a problem on some of our soils because of the high levels that we have.